stones that remember silence. Night still clung to the edge of the sky like thin cloth caught on a nail, and in that cloth were a few pale points of light, not bright, not important, simply present. The air stood steady, cool, slightly damp, and it held no competing smells. Only the faint bitterness of stone that had long lived in shade, and the subtle, nearly invisible breathing of water somewhere below, beyond the line of houses. The city neither slept nor woke. It simply was. The houses stood as they always had. Straight, restrained, with no desire to impress. Windows like empty frames reflected nothing. The night was too soft to reflect. Alleys stretched between walls like narrow beds of dried-up streams. And everywhere, silence, not as a ban, but as a habit. Lynn woke before dawn, the way people wake when they have long stopped expecting news from morning. He didn't open his eyes right away. First he listened, as if checking whether the world was still there. Silence stood even, and within it he could make out small, almost homely things. Wood clicked somewhere in the wall, as if the house were stretching far away. A single drop of water fell, one drop, unhurried, not repeating. Dust rustled on the roof, and it was a sound not of motion, but of settling. He sat on the edge of the bed and for a second rested his palms on his knees, as if giving himself time to become who he was. The room was small. One shelf, a narrow table, a simple chair. On the table lay a notebook with a firm cover and a pencil worn blunt from constant use. Beside it, a heavy ring of keys, like a small anchor. Lynn stood, pulled on a warm jacket that had long taken the shape of his shoulders, and went to the window. Below, in the narrow street, lay grey half-dark. The paving stones were damp but didn't shine. The street looked empty, and yet it held life, the kind that needs no witnesses. Fine dust on a ledge, a wet streak on a wall, the rough breath of an old tree on the corner. He didn't hurry. In this city there was nowhere to hurry to, and any haste would look foreign, like loud laughter in a library. He set a small kettle on a hot plate and waited until the water began to stir quietly, almost shyly. He brewed dried herbs, the same ones he kept on the windowsill. The scent was soft, not sweet, slightly astringent. He drank half a mug, thinking of nothing special, simply feeling warmth in his hands. Then he took the keys, the notebook, and the pencil, checked that the door was shut, and stepped outside. Outside, the air was a touch colder than in the room. It touched his cheeks like a hand that didn't need to explain itself. The sky brightened slowly, without promises. Lynn walked down the street toward the place that was his work and his habit, his quiet reason to get up in the mornings. He walked as if his steps were part of his breathing. Not loud, not overly soft, just even. The stones underfoot were uneven in their own way. Some smoothed by time, some rough, some slightly raised, and every step was a small conversation with the ground without words. The city opened around him gradually. First the narrow street, then a small crossroads where a lamp-post stood unlit, and nearby a low wall covered in moss. Then a square, empty as an open palm. In the center there had once been a fountain basin, but now it held dry leaves, last year's and this year's, and a few pebbles brought by wind or someone's hand. Water never returned to the fountain, and no one complained. Farther on the path led to a staircase, wide, stone, with low steps. Lynn loved that staircase. It didn't demand effort, but it gave the feeling of entering a different state. At the top began a district where the houses stood a little farther apart, and trees grew between them, thin, patient trees with branches that knew how to hold the sky. There, among the trees, stood a building without a sign. It was neither beautiful nor ugly, just right. Dark stone, 2 rows of windows, a heavy wooden door. On the door, a small metal plate with a barely visible engraving. A mark like a circle and two lines, as if it were a simple sketch of an ear or a wave. Lynn inserted the key, turned it slowly so the lock wouldn't click too sharply, and stepped inside. Inside it was cool and dry. It smelled of dust, paper, and something else, old wood that no longer lived, yet still held its shape. This was the House of Silence, as the few who remembered names still called it. Sometimes they called it the archive. Sometimes the storehouse. But Lynn knew those words were imprecise. This place didn't store things. It stored the pauses between things. He lit a small lamp in the corridor. The light was warm and low. It didn't chase shadows away, it simply made them visible. The corridor stretched straight ahead, doors lining both sides into halls. Lynn walked to the first door on the left and stopped, listening. This was his rule. Before opening a hall, he needed to hear what was happening inside, even if nothing was happening. He opened the door. The hall was large, with a high ceiling. Shelves stood in rows, holding cardboard boxes wrapped in cloth and tied with cord. On each box, a small tag with one word or two written in pencil. Not dates, not names, not places. Words. Sometimes simple. Footsteps, rain, stove. Sometimes strange. Morning without hurry, shadow on water, window after sleep. These boxes held no objects. They held recordings. Not on paper, at least not only on paper. Inside were small cylinders, discs, thin tapes, and sometimes just pebbles or bits of wood as markers. But the main thing was this. Inside were sounds. Long ago, people in the city decided that sound was what vanished fastest. Words could be written down, objects could be kept, but sound disappeared as if it had never existed. So someone began to gather sounds. Not loud events, not celebrations, not crowds. But what no one usually counts as important. How a window closes, how fabric rustles in wind, how a stair creaks, how water drips into an empty bowl. Each sound became a small proof that life had been. Lynn didn't know who first invented it. He came to the House of Silence when most people had already left the city. He didn't come because he wanted to be a keeper. He simply found himself here one day, and the building accepted him as calmly as stone accepts shade. He walked between the shelves, touching the tags with his fingertips without reading, just feeling their smoothness. He stopped at a row where the boxes were newer, at least, by the city's standards. These were the boxes Head made himself. On them were his words. Ice on glass, dry herbs, empty square in the morning. He didn't think of it as his contribution. He thought of it as the city's breathing continuing. He had daily work, simple, but requiring attention. He checked humidity in the halls so the tapes wouldn't spoil. He wiped dust so it wouldn't grow heavy. He listened to a few recordings to make sure they hadn't faded. And he made new ones, not every day, but often. Today he planned to go beyond the familiar streets, out where the city thinned into empty blocks and then into fields and low hills. There was an old bridge there, and beneath it water sometimes sounded like a string, thin and steady. Lynn wanted to record it again, because in recent weeks the water had sounded different. Not worse, not better. Just different. And he believed it mattered to capture changes, even the quietest ones. He opened his notebook and made a few brief notes, short, without explanation. He had his own language. He didn't describe in words what could be felt. He wrote only what needed remembering. Time, wind direction, humidity, the state of the sky. And sometimes, one word not about the sound, but about himself. Today he wrote, brightening. After that he went to the small room where the tools were kept. There was a heavy cloth bag inside it, his recorder, plain and sturdy, and a few small containers for samples, in case he found something he wanted to keep as a marker. He checked the batteries, checked the tape, packed everything, zipped the bag, and once more listened to the building silence. In that silence it was easy to hear his own breathing. And it didn't feel too loud. He locked the house of silence, not as one locks property, but as one locks a promise to return, and set out. The walk to the bridge wasn't short, but Lynn loved long walks. In them there was no task of arriving. There was a chance to be inside time. He walked through quarters where houses still had intact roofs, but windows were boarded up. He passed a garden where trees grew too thickly, as if trying to cover the empty walls. He went by a workshop whose display still held tools, now coated in such dust that they looked like drawings. Sometimes it seemed to him the city wasn't abandoned. It had simply become very quiet, like a person who was tired of speaking. And then Lynn felt not lonely, but needed. Not like a hero, not like a savior. Just like someone willing to listen. When he left the dense blocks behind, the air changed. It grew wider. The smell of grass appeared, not bright, but dry. The wind was more noticeable here. It didn't blow, it shifted, sliding along the ground, brushing the tops of shrubs. The sky was already light, but the sun hadn't risen, and everything around looked as if it were made of one calm material, grey-blue, steady. The bridge did not appear at once. First there was a low hollow, then a path along an old channel, then 2 stone supports, and between them an arch. The bridge was old but strong. The stones at its base were large, warm-looking. Moss grew on it, and from that moss you could tell where shade most often lay. Beneath the bridge, water ran. Not a river, more a stream, but a deep, stubborn one. It didn't hurry anywhere. It simply moved because movement was its nature. Lynn went down the path to the water. It was cooler there. The shadow under the bridge was dense, but not frightening. The water sounded softly, and in different places the sound changed. Where it touched stone, gentle where it fell in a thin trickle, high and fine where it ran under a tree root, duller, deeper. He set his bag on a dry rock, took out the recorder, switched it on, and for a few minutes simply listened. He never began recording immediately. First he tuned himself to the sound, so he wouldn't intrude with expectation. Then he pressed the button, and the tape began to take in the world. Lynn crouched, tilting his head so his ear was closer to the water. He felt cold rise from the stone into his knees. He felt his fingers slowly go numb, but he didn't move. In that moment it seemed to him he wasn't a person at all, but part of the bridge, part of the shadow, part of the water. Not an important part, just an allowed one. The recording lasted a long time. He didn't count minutes. He counted shifts. At first the water sounded even. Then the wind strengthened a little and leaves above him rustled, adding dry whispering to the water. Then somewhere on the bridge a small stone fell, not loudly, but distinctly. Then everything returned to evenness again. Lynn stopped the recording and carefully packed the device away. He exhaled slowly, as if returning the sound to the air. He took a small slip of paper, made a note, and placed it with the tape. It was his rule. Every recording must have a name. Not for history, not for reports, only for attention. To name something is to notice it. He wrote, Water under the bridge. Almost morning. Then he stood and for a moment watched the water without thinking about it. The water was like a thought you don't have to hold. It passed, and in that there was calm. On the way back he didn't take the same route. He decided to pass through blocks he hadn't visited in a long time. There was an old greenhouse there, glass-framed, partly ruined, but, by rumor, still holding some plants inside. Lynn didn't trust rumors, but he wanted to see. The path to the greenhouse ran along a wall webbed with cracks. The stones of the wall were like faces that had forgotten expression. Beyond the wall began empty plots where yards had once been. Now tall grasses grew there, and small birds hid in them, making short, coarse sounds rather than singing. The greenhouse appeared as a pale shape among the grasses. The glass roof was broken, but the frame stood. The door was ajar, as if someone had passed through not long ago. Lynn stopped, listening. Inside was quiet, but it was a different quiet, more humid, more alive. He went in. It smelled of soil. Not fresh soil, but old soil threaded with roots. Light fell through the broken panes in slanted bands, and in those bands dust motes drifted down like tiny snowflakes. Empty pots stood in corners, some overturned. Seed tables were broken, but on one, near a wall, a plant still grew. Not large, but green. Its leaves were thick, slightly dark, as if they had learned to live without direct sun. Lynn leaned closer. The plant felt familiar and not. He didn't name plants the way botanists do. He gave them quiet names. Green patience, a leaf that doesn't surrender. He took a small container from his bag and gathered a pinch of soil near the root, just a little, careful not to harm it. It wasn't for science. It was a marker. Sometimes he brought back soil, leaves, dry stems to the house of silence, mute signatures for the sounds. In the greenhouse there was another sound. Lynn didn't notice it at first. It was a faint, nearly invisible drip. Somewhere above, from a crack, water fell slowly onto an iron edge, and each time a drop struck, it made a short ring, metal breathing. He took out the recorder and captured it too. Not long, just a few minutes. Enough to preserve its character. Not loud, not sad, simply present. When he stopped, it felt as if the greenhouse had grown a shade quieter, as though the sound had gone with the tape. But that was only a feeling. Sounds don't leave the world that easily. They just stop belonging to one place and become part of another. On his way out he saw footprints on the ground. Not fresh, slightly blurred. Bootprints leading in and back out. Someone had been here. Not long ago, but not today. Lynn paused, looked at them, and a strange feeling rose in him, not fear, not joy. More like gentle surprise, the way you feel when you find a new stone lying on an empty road. He didn't follow the tracks. In this city tracks weren't an invitation. They were only a fact. Someone else still walks. Someone else still breathes. That was enough. As he returned to the house of silence, the sun climbed higher. Light warmed, and the stones on the street began to dry. The city looked different, not like shadow, but like a drawing. Colors emerged on the walls. Grey, ochre, a hint of green. Thin lines on rooftops became visible that had been hidden before. Lynn entered the house of silence, again pausing at the door to listen, and locked it behind him. Inside, the air was the same coolness. He went to the recording room, where a table stood and an old cupboard held empty boxes. He carefully took out the tapes, labeled the boxes, slipped the notes inside, and set them on the shelf marked new. Then he sat at the table and opened his notebook. The entries were brief, but full of life. He wrote, bridge, water softer, greenhouse, drip on metal, green patience, footprints. He stopped, looking at the word footprints. He didn't want to expand it. He didn't want to build stories. Stories often make silence noisy. But he felt the fact mattered, not as an event, but as a sign that the city still allowed people. After that he did his usual tasks. He checked humidity in the halls, opening doors carefully so the air wouldn't rush in too sharply. He wiped dust from shelves. Dust here wasn't an enemy, it was time. But time needed form, so it wouldn't spread everywhere. Then he chose an older box labeled Threshold. He couldn't remember what it held. He opened it, took out the tape, and played it. At first there was a quiet, dense hush. Then footsteps on wood. A creak. Then a short pause. And then, a door closing. There was something homely in that sound, like the motion of a hand closing a window before rain. Lynn listened and felt that he wasn't just hearing a sound, he was remembering a state. Threshold. The moment of crossing. The point where you are still here, but already there. He turned it off and sat a long time without moving. In moments like this, the House of Silence did something strange to him. He stopped being a solitary person in an empty city and became part of a long, calm current. People came and went, but their footsteps remained, not as marks in dust, but as traces in air. He didn't know how much time had passed when he heard a sound outside. It wasn't wind, and it wasn't water. It was a sound rare here. A cautious knock. At first he thought he imagined it. Then it came again. 3 soft taps, as if someone feared disturbing. Lynn stood. His heart didn't race, but his body became more attentive. He walked to the corridor door and listened. The outside silence was dense, and within it there truly was presence. He approached the front door, placed his palm against the wood. The wood was cold. He turned the key slowly and opened it a crack. A woman stood on the threshold. She wore a long coat, dusty but tidy. Her hair was gathered back. Her face was calm, no pleading, no demand. In her hands was a bag, and over her shoulder a small rolled bundle, like those carried by people who travel far and carry little. Lynn said nothing at once. He looked at her the way you look at a rare bird. Not wanting to catch it, only to be sure it's real. The woman dipped her head slightly, acknowledging him. I heard there's a place here where silence is kept, she said very quietly. It was almost a dialogue. Lynn didn't like dialogue. But her words were so simple they didn't break the calm. He stepped aside, opening the door wider. She entered. She smelled of the road, dry dust, cloth, and something else, perhaps grass. She looked around without letting her gaze linger too long on anything, as if respecting the space. Lynn closed and locked the door, then turned to her. He felt he should respond, even though words were not the main thing here. We keep sounds, he said. And the pauses between them. She nodded. She glanced down the corridor, at the hall doors, at the lamp. My name is Mira, she said. Lynn hesitated for a moment, wondering whether to say his own. But a name is also a sound, and it can be gentle. Lynn. They stood in the corridor, and the silence around them did not shrink. It simply accepted 2 new breaths. Lynn showed her the small room by the entrance where there was a table and 2 mugs. He set the kettle on. His movements were familiar, but today they held a slight carefulness, as if he were working not only for himself, but under another person's gaze. Mira sat with her hands on her knees and looked not at him, but at the space. She was someone who could be silent without strain. The kettle boiled. Lynn brewed herbs and poured into 2 mugs. He placed one in front of Mira and took the other. They drank without speaking, and it wasn't awkward. It felt right, like a room having 2 windows instead of 1. After a while, Mira took out a small object, a thin disc wrapped in cloth. She set it on the table carefully, the way you set down something that might break, even though it wasn't glass. "I brought a sound," she said. The words came out as though she had brought not an object, but a living thing. Lynn looked at the disc and felt respect rise in him. Not toward her as a person, but toward her action. Someone else understood the value of this. "What kind?" he asked. "The house where I grew up," Mira said. There was a door that always tapped a little in the wind. It felt like the house was talking to me. When I left, I recorded that tapping. And now the house is gone. But the tapping remains. Lynn nodded. He didn't ask how the house disappeared. Disappearance was natural in this world. He didn't ask where it had been. Places mattered less than sound. He simply took the disc, without unwrapping it, and placed it near the notebook. "Well, give it a place," he said. Mira lowered her gaze. It looked like gratitude, but without drama. After tea, Lynn led her along the corridor. He opened hall doors and showed the shelves, the boxes, the tags. Mira walked slowly, as if afraid to disturb the air. She read some of the words on tags but didn't touch them. When she reached the new shelf, she stopped at the box labeled "Water Under the Bridge." "Almost morning. You record what almost no one notices," she said. Lynn shrugged. "I notice." "That's enough." In one hall there was a small corner with old armchairs and a little table where recordings could be played. Lynn offered her a seat. She stood at first, as if uncertain about sitting in a place that wasn't hers. Then Saturday. Lynn took out the tape head just made, "Greenhouse. Drip on metal," and played it. The ring of the drop was thin and steady. It held no sadness, but it held waiting. Each drop fell alone, and between drops was a pause where you could hear the air staying still. Mira listened. Her face didn't change, but her eyes grew deeper, like someone remembering something important without rushing to name it. When it ended, she said nothing. Neither did Lynn. They sat, and the silence between them was not empty, it was full. So the day passed. They spoke little. Mira helped Lynn wipe dust in one hole, not because he asked, but because it felt natural. She did it gently, as if wiping not shelves but the surface of water. Lynn noticed how quietly she moved, how she avoided the boards that creaked, as though she had long lived among silence. In the evening, when the light outside softened and stretched, Lynn offered her the small room by the entrance for the night. There was a folding cot, a blanket, a pillow. The house of silence was not a guest house, but it could hold a person for a short time. Mira nodded. In her nod there was no relief and no embarrassment. Just agreement. That night Lynn lay in his room and listened. Now the building held one more breath. It didn't interfere. It was like an extra string on an instrument that had sounded alone for a long time. In the morning they woke almost at the same time. Lynn brewed tea again. Mira sat by the window, looking down at the street where light lay on the stones, and it seemed she wasn't looking at the city but into herself. After breakfast, Lynn suggested they go out together. He wanted to show her the bridge, the water, the greenhouse, not as a tour, but as part of his work that could become hers too, if she wished. They walked through the streets slowly. Their footsteps sounded different from the footsteps of one person. Not louder. Just a more complex pattern. Sometimes their steps matched, sometimes they didn't, and there was its own quiet music in that. The city received them calmly. No changes, no signs. But Lynn noticed small things. A bird hopping from a roof to a branch, wind lifting a leaf and laying it down by a wall, light falling on a window frame so it looked like a living line. Under the bridge the water sounded just as softly. Lynn didn't record it. Today it was enough to listen. Mira crouched on a stone near the stream and watched the flow curve around an obstacle. Lynn could see she wasn't searching for meaning. She was simply present. In the greenhouse the drop still fell on metal. The ring was slightly different, maybe because the air was warmer, or because they came at a different hour. Lynn thought he could record it again, but didn't. He felt today wasn't a day for collecting. It was a day for shared quiet. When they returned to the House of Silence, Mira took out her disc. Lynn prepared a place for the new recording. He chose an empty box and began to label its tag, not asking for a title. But Mira said, "Name it a door that didn't want to disappear." Lynn wrote the words. They were long, but they felt exact. He placed the disc into the device and pressed play. The tapping was soft and dry, with slight unevenness, as if the wind wasn't always the same. Between taps was a pause, and in that pause you could hear the house holding air inside itself. It was the sound of daily life, not of events. And those were the sounds that made life recognizable. Lynn listened and felt something gentle rise in him. It seemed the House of Silence had become a little more like a home than before, not because of its walls, but because someone had brought a memory that didn't belong to him. In the days that followed, Mira stayed. At first it felt temporary, like a pause in travel. But later it stopped needing a name. She was simply there. They worked together, never discussing who did what. Mira found boxes she wanted to hear and listened. Sometimes she made brief notes in her own notebook. Lynn noticed she had one too, just as plain, unadorned. Sometimes they walked beyond the city. Mira showed Lynn a patch where the grass smelled different, slightly sweet, but not cloying. Lynn showed her a narrow street where a sound like a whisper appeared at noon. Wind slipping between two walls, making the air thin. They recorded those sounds and set new boxes on the shelves. New tags appeared in the House of Silence. Wind in a narrow passage, grass afternoon, 2 sets of steps on stone. Lynn was surprised by that last tag. It was Mira's. She wrote it herself without asking. He saw her fastening it to the box and said nothing. It felt right. Because now their presence in the city had become something worth noticing too. Time passed, not like a calendar, but like the changing of light. Days grew longer, nights softer. The water under the bridge grew slightly louder because in the hills unseen reserves began to melt. In the greenhouse the drop fell more often. The plant in the corner grew a few new leaves. One day Lynn and Mira sat in the listening corner and played threshold. The wooden creak, the pause, the door. Mira closed her eyes. "I used to think silence was when nothing is there," she said, very softly, almost a whisper, as if afraid to disturb the air. "But here I understood that silence is when everything is there, and nothing demands anything." Lynn didn't answer. He only nodded. He felt something settle inside him, like dust finally finding its place. That evening they went outside. The sky was clear, the light warm. The paving stones were no longer damp, they were dry and warm to the touch. They reached the square with the empty fountain. Leaves lay in the basin, and the wind moved them slightly, making a gentle rustle. Lynn took out the recorder and captured the rustle. Mira stood beside him, watching the leaves shift as if they were a small sea. When it ended, Lynn labeled it. Leaves in the basin. An evening without hurry. He didn't try to make it a symbol. He simply noted it. Night came slowly. The windows of the houses darkened, but those dark rectangles held no emptiness. They held depth. Lynn and Mira returned to the House of Silence, lit the lamp, and brewed tea. Then they went to their rooms. Every silence needs private space. But before closing his door, Lynn lingered in the corridor. He listened. The building breathed evenly. Wood clicked somewhere. Water dripped far away. Somewhere, in another room, Mira quietly turned in her sleep, and the fabric of the blanket rustled. Lynn stood and felt how that sound, not loud, not important, became part of his world. He didn't think about the future. He didn't make plans. He simply knew he would rise early again tomorrow. He would brew tea. He would open the House of Silence. And perhaps they would go to the bridge or the greenhouse again. Or perhaps they would stay inside and listen to the old recordings. There was no victory in it, and no defeat. Only calm continuation. Like the water under the bridge. Like a drop on metal. Like footsteps on stone, no longer lonely, yet just as quiet. The city remained forgotten, but its silence was no longer empty. It became a place where you could live without hurry, without explaining, without proving. A place where stones remembered not loud stories, but simple presence. Lynn lay down, closed his eyes, and listened one last time. Silence lay close, like a smooth blanket. And within it he heard the most important thing. The world hadn't vanished. It had simply learned to speak softly.